Chapter 7 Holy Cross and Cashel of the Kings. If one doesn't like bacon and eggs, one must go without breakfast in Ireland, unless one likes fish, or is content with bread and butter. Every evening Betty would have a colloquy with the maid, which ran something like this. "What will you be wanting for breakfast, miss?" "What can we have?" "Oh, anything you like, miss." "Well, what, for instance?" "There's bacon and eggs, miss, and there's fish." We usually took bacon and eggs, for fish seemed out of place on the breakfast table. Besides, we were sure to encounter it later at dinner. "And will ye have coffee or tea, miss?" the maid would continue. We took coffee once, and after that we took tea. The tea is good, though strong, and it seems somehow to suit the climate. But one sip of Irish coffee will be enough for most people. So next morning we sat down to our breakfast of tea and bacon and eggs with a good appetite. The cloth was not as clean as it might have been, but the eggs were fresh and the bacon sweet, and the bread and butter were delicious, as they are all over Ireland, and the tea tasted better than I had ever imagined tea could taste. And outside the sun was shining brightly, but no brighter than the face of the maid who waited on us, and there was a pleasant stir of movement up and down the street, for it was Saturday and market day, so that it was quite impossible to be otherwise than happy and content. And presently the car I had arranged for the night before drove up, and we were off on the 4-mile drive to the ruins of Holy Cross Abbey. We had to go slowly at first, for the street was crowded with people come to market, and with wares exposed for sale. There were little carts heaped high with brown turf, which might be bought for 2 or 3 shillings a load, though every load represented as many days' hard work. There were red calves in little pens, and chickens in crates, and eggs and butter in baskets. And there were a lot of peddlers offering all sorts of dry goods and hardware and odds and ends to the country people who stood stolidly around, apparently rather sorry they had come. The faces were typically Irish, the men with short noses and shaved lips and little fuzzy side whiskers, and the women with cheeks almost startlingly ruddy. But there wasn't a trace of those rollicking spirits which the Irish in books and on the stage seldom fail to display. Once clear of the crowd, we rolled out of the town, over a bridge above the railway, and along a pleasant road, past little thatched cottages overflowing with children, meeting from time to time a family driving to town, all crowded together on a little cart behind a shaggy donkey, the men with their feet hanging down, the women scrooched up under their shawls, with their knees as high as their chins. They all stared at us curiously, but our driver passed them by with disdain, as not worth his notice, and from a word or two he let fall, it was evident that he considered them beneath him. The road was rather higher than the surrounding country, and we could see across it, north and south, for many miles. Then it descended to a winding stream, the Suir, flowing gently between rushy banks, and presently we saw ahead a great pile of crumbling buildings. And then we were at Holy Cross, one of the most exquisite and interesting of the hundreds of ruins which cover Ireland. That word hundreds is no exaggeration. In a single day's journey one will see scores. And as one goes on thus, day after day, one begins to realise what a populous and wealthy country Ireland was 800 years ago, how crowded with castles and monasteries. And I think the deepest impression the traveller bears away with him is the memory of these battered and deserted remnants of former grandeur. And yet, it is not quite just to blame England for them, as most of the Irish do. It was the English, of course, who broke up the monasteries and destroyed many of the castles. But the march of the centuries would probably have wrought much the same ruin in the end. For men no longer live in castles, finding homes far pleasanter. And it is not now to monks they go for learning, nor is the right of sanctuary needed, as it was in the time when might made right, and a poor man's only hope of safety lay in getting to some altar ahead of his pursuers. Yet one cannot tread these beautiful places without a certain sadness and regret. Regret for the vanished pomp and ceremony, the cowl processions and torchlit feasts, the shuffle of feet and the songs of minstrels. In a word, for the old order, so impressive, so picturesque, and so cruel. Holy Cross was a great place in those days, for, as its name indicates, it held as its most precious relic a fragment of the true cross, given by the Pope in 1110 to Donogh O'Brien, grandson of Brian Boru, and thousands of pilgrims came to pray before it. The relic had many strange vicissitudes in the centuries that followed, but it was not lost, as was the one which the Cross of Cong enshrined, and it is preserved today in the Ursuline convent at Blackrock. Holy Cross had better luck than most, for, at the dissolution in 1563, it was granted to the Earl of Ormond, a friend who cherished it. But the end came with the passing of the Stuarts, and now it is deserted save for the old woman who acts as a caretaker, and who lives in a little ivy-covered house built against the wall of the great church. She opened the iron gate which bars access to the ruins, and let us wander about them at will, for which we were very grateful. The plan of the place is that common to almost all monastic establishments, a cruciform church, with the altar at the east end, as near as Jerusalem, the arms of the cross, or transepts, stretching north and south, and the body of the cross, or nave, extending to the west, where the main entrance was. A door from the nave opened to the south into a court around which were the cloisters and the domestic buildings, the refectory, the chapter house, and the dormitories. And still beyond these were the granaries and storehouses and guest houses and various outbuildings. Also, like most others, it stands on the bank of a river, for the monks were fond of fishing, and had no mind to go hungry on Friday. The roof of the church has fallen in, but it is otherwise well preserved, even to the window tracery, and the square tower above the crossing is apparently as firm as ever. The whole place abounds in beautiful detail, proof of the loving workmanship that was lavished on it. But its bright particular gem is a little sanctum in the north transept, surrounded by delicate twisted pillars, and covered by a roof beautifully groined. Whether this was the sanctuary of the relic, or the place where the monks were laid from death to burial, or the tomb of some saintly abbot, no one knows. But there it is, a living testimony to the beauty of Irish artistry. The cloister is now a grass-grown court, and only a few arches remain of the colonnade which once surrounded it. But the square of domestic buildings about it is better preserved than one will find almost anywhere else, and deserves careful exploration. As was the custom in most of the abbeys, the friars, when they died, were laid to rest beneath the flags of the church floor. The church is still used as a burial place, and is cluttered with graves, marked by stones leaning at every angle. One's feet sink deep into the mould, a mould composed, so the caretaker told us in awestruck voice, of human dust. We mounted the narrow staircase to the tower roof, and sat there for a long time, gazing down on these lichened and crumbling walls, restoring them in imagination and repeopling them with the White Brothers, and the Pilgrims, and the innumerable hangers-on who once crowded them. It required no great stretch of fancy to conjure the old days back. That day, for instance, 3 centuries and more ago, when Red Hugh O'Donnell, marching southward from Galway with his army to join the Spaniards at Kinsale, came down yonder white highway and stopped at the monastery gate, and invoked a blessing from the abbot. And the abbot, with all the monks in attendance, carried the fragment of the cross in its gilded shrine out to the gate, and held it up for all to see. And Red Hugh and his men knelt down there in the road, while the priest prayed that through them Ireland might win freedom. And even as they knelt, a wild-eyed rapparee came pounding up with the news that a great force of English was at Cashel, a few miles away. So Red Hugh had to flee with his men over the hills to the westward, to die a year later, poisoned by a man he thought his friend. We descended after a time, and crossed the river to have a look at the abbey from that vantage ground. And at last, most regretfully, we mounted the car again, and drove back to Thurles. An hour later, we were at Cashel, the one place in all Ireland best worth seeing. I write that in all earnestness. If the traveller has time for only one excursion out of Dublin, he should hesitate not an instant, but go to Cashel. I shall try to tell why. Cashel is a rock some 300 feet high, dropped down among the pastures along the northern edge of the Golden Vale of Tipperary. I do not know how the geologists explain it. How the Irish explain it I have told already. Its sides are of the steepest, and its flat top is about 2 acres in extent. In itself it is a natural fortress, and it was of course seized upon as such by the dim people who fought back and forth over the length and breadth of Ireland, in the far ages before history begins. At first it was strengthened by a wall around the top. Any such defensive wall in Ireland is called a cashel, as one of earth is called a rath. And there are both raths and cashels all up and down the land, for forts have always been sorely needed there. But this is the cashel above all others. Buildings were put up inside the wall, rude at first, but gradually growing more elaborate. And when the real history of the place begins, say about 15 centuries ago, it was already the seat of the Kings of Munster, that is, of the southern half of Ireland. Hither about 450 came St. Patrick to convert the king and his household. It was while preaching here that he is said first to have plucked the trefoil or shamrock to illustrate the principle of the 3-in-1. Brian Boru strengthened its fortifications, and in 1134 was consecrated here that wonderful chapel of Cormac MacCarthy, King of Munster, which still endures as a most convincing demonstration of the beauty of old Irish architecture. Then a round tower was put up, and then a castle, and then a great cathedral, for King Murtagh had granted the rock to the religious of Ireland, and the Archbishop of Cashel came, before long, to be nearly as powerful as the great Archbishop of Armagh. And then a monastery was built, and schools, under the sway first of the Benedictines and later of the Cistercians. All this made a stupendous group of buildings, a splendid and impressive symbol of Cashel's greatness. But under Elizabeth, the scale turned. Dermot O'Hurley, Archbishop of Cashel, was taken prisoner and carried to Dublin and hanged. His successor, Millen McGrath, abjured his religion under Elizabethan pressure and proved the sincerity of his Protestantism, married not once, but twice. From that time on, the place was used as a Protestant cathedral, until in 1744 Archbishop Price succeeded to the see. Now the Archbishop was a man who loved his ease, and though his palace was situated conveniently enough at the foot of the rock, his church was perched most inconveniently upon it, and the only way even an archbishop could get to it was to walk. Price spent a lot of money trying to build a carriage road up the rock, but finally he gave it up and procured from Parliament an act decreeing that, whereas in several dioceses cathedral churches are so incommodiously situated that they cannot be resorted to for divine service, power should be given to the chief governor, with assent of the Privy Council, to remove the site of a cathedral church to some convenient parish church. 2 years later, in 1749, an act was passed directing that the cathedral be removed from the rock into the town. This was, of course, impossible in any but a metaphorical sense, but, incredible as it may seem, since he couldn't remove it, Price determined to destroy it, secured from the government the loan of a regiment of soldiers, and set them to work tearing it down. They stripped off the leaden roof, knocked in the vaulting, and left the place the ruin that it is today. It might be remarked in passing that here is one ruin Cromwell didn't make. George II was King of England in 1749, and Cromwell had been dead nearly 100 years. I shall never forget my first glimpse of this stupendous pile of buildings, looming high in the air, all turrets and towers, like those fairy palaces which Maxfield Parrish loves to paint. A short branch runs down from Gould's Cross to Cashel, and it was from the windows of the rickety little train we peered, first on this side and then on that. And then, quite suddenly, away to the left, we saw the rock, golden grey, high against the sky, so fairy-like and ethereal that it seemed impossible it could be anything more than a wonderful vision or mirage. And then the train stopped, and we jumped out and hurried from the station, and presently we were following the path around the rock. But that was too slow, and with a simultaneous impulse, we left the path and climbed the wall, and hastened upward over rock and heather, straight towards this new marvel. We skirted another wall, and climbed a stile, and then we were stopped by a high iron gate, secured with a chain and formidable padlock. But we had scarcely time to feel the shock of disappointment, when we saw hastening upward toward us a sturdy old man, with weather-beaten face framed by a shock of reddish-grey hair and beard, and a moment later we had the pleasure of meeting John Minogue, the caretaker, the most accomplished caretaker, I venture to say, in all the length and breadth of Ireland. For, as we soon found, he has the history and legends and architectural peculiarities of Cashel at his tongue's end. He knows them intimately, accurately, in every detail, for he has lived with them all his life, and loves them. He unlocked the iron gate and ushered us in, and chased away the rabble of ragged children who had followed him up from the village. And then began one of the most delightful experiences that I have ever had. I almost despair of attempting to describe it. At our feet lay the Vale of Tipperary, an expanse of greenest green stretching unbroken to the foot of a great mountain chain, the Galtees, 30 miles away. Farther to the north, we could just discern the gap of the Devil's Bit, beyond which lay Limerick and the Shannon. And then we walked to the other side of the rock, and there, away in the distance, towered the great bulk of queenly Slieve-na-Mon, the mountain of fair women, and as we stood there gazing at it, John Minogue told us how it got its name. It was in the days when Cormac, son of Art, was king of Erin, and Finn, son of Cúil, Finn the Fair, he of the high deeds, whose name I shall spell hereafter as it is pronounced, Finn MacCool, had been declared by birthright and by sword right captain of that invincible brotherhood of fighting men, the Fianna. Finn was past his youth, and had a comely son, Uiscin, the sweet singer. But at times his spirit hung heavy on him, for his wife was dead, and no man has peaceful slumber who was without a fitting mate. So he looked about for one to share his bed, but found it hard to choose, for there were many fine women in Erin. And at last in his perplexity he sat himself down on the summit of Slieve-na-Mon, and said that all who wished might run a race from the bottom to the top, and she who won should be his wife. So it was done, and the race was won by Grania, daughter of the great Cormac himself. The feast was set for a fortnight later, in the King's Hall at Tara, and what happened there we shall hear later on. We might have been standing yet upon the rock, gazing out across that marvellous valley, if John Minogue had not dragged us away to see the wonders of the place. Not the least of them is the weather-beaten stone cross, with the crucifixion on one side and an effigy of St. Patrick on the other, which stands just outside the castle entrance, on the rude pedestal where the kings of Munster were crowned in the old, old days. Here it was, perhaps, that St. Patrick himself stood when he stooped to pluck the trefoil, and that King Angus was baptised. Legend has it that, as he was performing that ceremony, the saint, without knowing it, drove the spiked end of his crosier through the king's foot. Angus said never a word, nor made a complaint, thinking it part of the rite. But when the saint went to take up his crosier and saw what he had done, he blessed the king and promised that none of that royal stock should die of wounds forever. Perhaps the promise was not forever, for 5 centuries later, Brian Boru, the greatest of them all, was killed in battle at Clontarf, as I have told. But the greatest wonder of all at Cashel is the jewel of a chapel built by Cormac, and standing as firm today as when its stones were laid, 8 centuries ago. It nestles in between the choir and south transept of the later cathedral, and its entrance is the most magnificent doorway of its kind existing anywhere on this earth. It is round-headed, as in all Irish Romanesque, with 5 deep mouldings rich in dogtooth and lozenge ornamentation, and though it is battered and weather-worn, it is still most beautiful and impressive. Inside, the chapel is divided into nave and chancel, both very small, but decorated with a richness and massiveness almost oppressive. Twisted columns, arcaded walls, dogtooth mouldings, rounded arches, traceried surfaces, sculptured capitals, and I know not what beside. Facing the choir is a stone sarcophagus, beautifully ornamented with characteristic Celtic serpent work, as may be seen in the photograph. It is called King Cormac's Coffin. It was in the small apartment over the nave and under the steep stone roof that Cormac was struck down by an assassin as he knelt in prayer. It was something of a relief to get out into the high, roofless cathedral, where one feels at liberty to draw a deep breath. The cathedral is rich with sculptures too, but I shall not attempt to describe them. I can only hope that it may be your fortune to visit the place some day, and have John Minogue to take you around. But let me warn you, he does not waste time on the unsympathetic. While we stood admiring the sculptures of St. Patrick and St. Bridget and 11 of the Apostles in the north transept, the sculptor omitted St. Matthew for some unknown reason, or perhaps our guide told me why and I have forgotten. As we stood there gazing in delight at these inimitable figures, a party of 4 or 5 entered the church and stood staring vacantly about. "See here, Mr. Minogue," I said after a time. "We can amuse ourselves for a while, if you'd like to look after those other people." Minogue shot one glance at them. "No," he said, "they're not worth it. Now come, I must show you the round tower." A beauty the tower is, with walls 4 feet thick, built of great blocks of stone, and a little round-headed doorway, 12 feet above the ground. It stands 85 feet high, and is wonderfully preserved. But, when we looked up it from the inside, we saw that the old masons did not succeed in getting it quite true. It was an hour later, or perhaps 2 hours later, that we emerged again from the iron gate, and found the rabble of children still waiting. They closed in on us at once, murmuring something in a queer, half-mumble, half-whisper, of which we could not understand a word. "What is it they're saying?" we asked. "They are saying," explained Minogue, "that if your honour will toss a penny amongst them, they will fight for it. Or, if you'd rather, they will put up a prayer for you, so that you will get safe home again. They don't consider that begging, you see, since they offer some return for the money." And then, as they hustled us more closely, he turned and shouted something at them. Some magic incantation, I fancy, for they scurried away as though the devil was after them. I regretted, afterwards, that I had not asked him for the formula, but in the end we found one of our own, as you shall hear. Our guide insisted that we go down with him to his house and see his books, and write our names in his album, and have a cup of tea. He lived in an ivy-covered cottage, just under the rock, and his old wife came out to welcome us. And we sat and talked and wrote our names and looked at his books. One had been given him by Stephen Gwynn, and others by other writers whose names I have forgotten. But the treasure of his library was a huge volume, carefully wrapped against possible soiling, which, when unwrapped, proved to be a copy of Arthur Champney's Irish Ecclesiastical Architecture. And with gleaming face our host turned to the preface and showed us where Champneys acknowledged his indebtedness for much of the valuable assistance to John Minogue of the Rock of Cashel. We bade him goodbye at last, and made our way down through the quaint little town, which snuggles against one side of the rock. A town of narrow, crooked streets, and thatched houses, and friendly women leaning over their half-doors, and multitudinous children. But the most vivid memory I have of it is of the pleasant tang of turf smoke in the air. And presently we came out again upon the road leading to the station. From the top of the rock we had seen, in the middle of a field not far away, a ruin which seemed very extensive. And Minogue told us that it was Hoare Abbey, a Cistercian monastery built about 1272, but had added that it was scarcely worth visiting after Cashel. That was perhaps true. Few ruins can compare with Cashel, but when we saw the grey bulk of the old abbey looming above the wall at our left, we decided to get to it, if we could. It required some resolution, for the way hither lay across a very wet and muddy pasture, with grass knee-high in places, and Betty would probably have declined to venture but for the assurance that there are no snakes in Ireland. The nearer we got to the ruin, the worse the going grew, but we finally scrambled inside over a broken wall, and sat down on a block of fallen masonry to look about us. The mist, which had been thickening for the last half hour, had, almost imperceptibly, turned to rain, and this was mizzling softly down, shrouding everything as with a pearly veil, and adding a beauty and sense of mystery to the place which it may have lacked at other times. But it seemed to us singularly impressive, with its narrow lancet windows and plain square pillars. Such vaulting as remains, at the crossing and in the chapels, is very simple, and the whole church was evidently built with a dignity and severity of detail which modern builders might well imitate. It seems a shame that it is not kept in better order and a decent approach built to it, but I suppose the Board of Works, whose duty it is to care for Irish ruins, finds itself overburdened with the multiplicity of them. We sat there, absorbing the centuries-old atmosphere, until a glance at my watch told me that we must hurry if we would catch our train. We did hurry, though with many a backward glance, for one is reluctant to leave a beautiful place which one may never see again. But we caught the train, and the last glimpse we had of Cashel was as of some gigantic magic palace, suspended in air and shrouded in mist.